The skyscrapers of the city loomed like steel giants against a pale, cloud-draped sky. Below, a fine drizzle misted the sidewalks, blurring the rush of tailored suits, briefcases, and umbrellas that punctuated the morning grind. The hum of engines and the rhythmic clicking of shoes on wet pavement created a melody of commerce and ambition, a heartbeat that pulsed relentlessly through the financial district. Amelia Brooks moved through this world with the precision of a dancer, her steps measured and her posture impeccable. At 29, she was the youngest financial consultant at Rivers & Company and the protégé of one of the most formidable figures in the business world, Victor Langford. At 54, with a fortune estimated around $750 million, Victor was a man who commanded respect without demanding it. His sharp eyes missed nothing, especially not the subtle details most people overlooked. The cut of a suit, the glint of a wristwatch, the quiet confidence or hesitation in a handshake. Amelia admired Victor, perhaps more than she'd ever admit aloud. He had taken her under his wing 3 years ago, pulling her out of obscurity and thrusting her into the high-stakes world of finance. He was demanding, relentless, and action-oriented. He never asked for opinions, he wanted decisions. Hesitation was met with steely disappointment, and uncertainty was unforgivable. She remembered the first time she'd faltered. "I guess I'm gonna—" The words had barely escaped her lips before Victor's face darkened, his voice turning cold and clipped. "Guess? We don't guess, Amelia. We decide. We act." She had swallowed her shame that day, but the lesson had burned itself into her core. There was no room for hesitation. This morning, she stood outside his office door, her pulse a steady thrum in her ears. The brass nameplate gleamed beneath her fingertips. Victor Langford, senior partner. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, smoothed the pleats of her pencil skirt, and entered. Victor was seated behind his vast mahogany desk, the city skyline stretching behind him. He wore a navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, no tie, the perfect blend of smart casual. His salt and pepper hair was swept back, and his eyes, piercing and unreadable, flicked up to meet hers. A brief, polite smile, one of his two voices, softened his expression. "Morning, Amelia," he said, his tone kind and pleasant. This was the voice he used with the world outside his elite circle. "Good morning, Mr. Langford," she replied, setting a thick folder on his desk. "The report you requested. All projections are mapped out through the next quarter." He nodded, flipping through the pages. "Well done." He paused, his gaze sharpening as he scrutinized her face. "You're wearing a new bracelet." Amelia's hand twitched reflexively, her fingers brushing against the delicate silver chain on her wrist. It was a small piece, understated, but Victor noticed everything. He didn't comment further. He never did. Instead, he closed the folder with a quiet thud. "Come with me," he said, rising. "We have a meeting downtown." The car ride was silent, the only sound the hum of the engine and the faint patter of rain on the windows. Victor scrolled through his phone, the glow of the screen illuminating his face. Occasionally, he would send an article or a study link to Amelia's phone, the chime echoing like a metronome of expectations. She knew he would want to discuss them later, dissecting every detail, extracting every actionable insight. They arrived at the imposing granite building of Hawthorne Investments. Victor stepped out first, his stride purposeful. Amelia followed, matching his pace. They entered the gleaming lobby, the scent of polished floors and coffee hanging in the air. The meeting room was a glass-walled chamber on the 50th floor, with a sweeping view of the city below. Inside, a dozen executives waited, men and women in expensive suits, their eyes calculating, their smiles thin. Victor's demeanor shifted subtly. His kind, pleasant voice evaporated, replaced by a tone sharp enough to cut glass. Quick, authoritative, almost aggressive. This was the Victor who faced his peers, a man who spoke in commands, not suggestions. As the meeting unfolded, Amelia took notes, her pen moving swiftly across the pages. She watched Victor navigate the conversation with surgical precision, his words a blend of intellect and power. But something else simmered beneath his polished exterior, a tension she couldn't quite name. An hour later, as the meeting concluded and hands were shaken, Victor's mask of authority slipped back into his polite, pleasant expression. They exited the building, the gray sky above mirroring the heaviness in Amelia's chest. Back in the car, Victor's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening. "Change of plans," he said, his voice low. "We're flying out tonight. I need you to come with me." Amelia blinked, surprised. "Where are we going?" "A small town upstate," he replied, his gaze distant. "It's personal. Personal." The word struck her. Victor never mixed business with anything personal. This was new, and a flicker of unease settled in her stomach. That evening, they boarded a private jet under the bruised purple sky. The cabin was cool and quiet, the leather seats pristine. Victor sat across from her, his expression inscrutable. He stared out the window as the jet lifted off, the city lights twinkling like distant stars below. As the plane leveled, Amelia finally spoke. "Mr. Langford, can I ask what this trip is about?" He hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment, she thought he might deflect, but then he sighed. "There's someone I need to see," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Someone I haven't spoken to in years." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and unspoken. Amelia studied his face, the fine lines etched around his eyes, the weight of something unspoken pressing on his shoulders. This was a side of Victor she'd never seen. A man with unfinished business, with secrets buried beneath layers of success. Amelia leaned back in her seat, a strange anticipation filling the silence. Whatever lay ahead, she knew one thing. This trip would change everything. The small town of Greystone unfolded beneath the early morning mist as the jet touched down on a modest airstrip. Rolling hills and sprawling meadows replaced the steel giants of the city. Everything seemed softer here, yet the quiet carried an inexplicable weight. Amelia stepped off the plane behind Victor, the chill in the air biting through her blazer. This was not the world of boardrooms and deals. This was something older, something unresolved. A black sedan waited at the edge of the tarmac. The driver, an older man with a kind face weathered by years of work, nodded silently as he loaded their bags. Victor slid into the back seat without a word. Amelia followed, the leather cool against her palms. As the car pulled away, Amelia studied Victor's face. His jaw was tight, his eyes distant. This was not the Victor Langford she knew. This was a man on the edge of something deeply personal, something that chipped away at his iron composure. They drove through narrow streets lined with modest homes and weathered storefronts. Amelia watched as Victor's eyes traced the buildings, his gaze flickering with recognition and restraint. When they finally stopped in front of a small, white-clapboard house, Amelia felt her breath catch. The house was unassuming, with faded shutters and a garden that had been tended with love but left to grow wild. A mailbox leaned slightly to one side, the paint chipping. The air felt thick with memories. Victor exhaled slowly. "Wait here," he said, his voice tight. Before she could respond, he stepped out and walked to the door. He knocked twice, his shoulders squared in a way that suggested he was bracing for impact. The door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 40s. Her auburn hair, streaked with gray, was tied back, and her eyes were a striking shade of green, the kind that held stories untold. She stared at Victor, her face shifting from shock to guarded disbelief. "Victor," she said, the word a whisper. "Hello, Anna," he replied, his voice betraying a vulnerability Amelia had never heard. Anna crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You finally decided to come back?" Victor nodded, swallowing hard. "I had to." Anna's eyes flicked to the car, landing on Amelia. Amelia shifted uncomfortably, feeling like an intruder. "Who's she?" Anna asked. "A colleague," Victor replied. "Her name is Amelia." Anna's gaze softened slightly. "Come in, both of you," she said after a pause. The house was warm but simple, filled with the scent of old wood and freshly brewed coffee. Amelia sat on a worn couch while Anna disappeared into the kitchen. Victor stood by the window, his back to Amelia, his shoulders tense. She's your sister, isn't she? Amelia asked softly. Victor turned, his expression unreadable. Yes. The word hung in the air, a key unlocking doors she hadn't known existed. The Victor Langford she knew was a man of power, precision, and control. But here he was something else. Someone who had roots, regrets, and wounds that hadn't healed. Anna returned with 3 mugs of coffee, setting them on the table. She sat in the armchair opposite Victor, studying him with a mixture of anger and longing. You've been gone 20 years, she said. Why now? Victor's fingers tightened around his mug. I made mistakes, he said quietly. I thought leaving was the best way to protect you. Protect me? Anna's voice trembled. From what? From me, Victor said. From the mess I was becoming. Amelia felt like a ghost in the room, witnessing a story she was never meant to hear. She watched as Anna's eyes filled with tears. You didn't protect me, Victor. You abandoned me. The words struck like a blow. Victor's face crumpled for a brief moment before he forced his composure back into place. I know, he whispered, and I've lived with that guilt every day. A silence settled over them, the weight of the past pressing down. Finally, Anna wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. So why are you here now? She asked. Victor looked at her, his eyes raw with emotion. Because I want to make things right. I want to know if there's still a chance for us to be a family. Anna's gaze softened, the edges of her anger eroding. It's not that easy, Victor. I know, he said, but I'm willing to try. That night, Amelia lay in the small guest room Anna had prepared for her. The sounds of the country night, crickets, the rustle of trees, felt strangely soothing. She thought about Victor, the man who had always seemed unbreakable, now struggling to piece together a shattered past. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Victor. Thank you for being here. This isn't over yet. Amelia stared at the words, a pang of realization settling in her chest. This trip was about more than just Victor's redemption. It was about her own path, her own choices. She had spent years following his lead, his rules. But what did she want? What was she going to do? For the first time, she didn't have an immediate answer, and that terrified her. She set the phone down, her thoughts tangled, and drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware that tomorrow would bring revelations that would change everything. Morning light seeped through the thin curtains, casting soft beams across Amelia's face. She blinked awake, the muffled sounds of clinking dishes and low voices reaching her ears. The weight of yesterday's revelations still hung heavily in her chest. Victor Langford, the unshakable force of the business world, was here, in this fragile place of unresolved pain. Amelia dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen. The scent of coffee and warm bread greeted her. Anna was at the stove, flipping pancakes with a quiet focus. Victor sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a steaming mug, eyes distant. Good morning, Amelia said softly. Anna turned and smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Morning, Amelia. Coffee? Yes, please. She poured herself a cup and sat across from Victor. He looked up, his face drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than she remembered. Did you sleep? She asked. Victor nodded slightly. A little. Before Amelia could respond, the sound of the front door creaking open interrupted them. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, and a man appeared in the doorway. He was in his early 30s, with dark hair and sharp blue eyes that narrowed as they landed on Victor. What are you doing here? The man asked, his voice cold. Victor's jaw tightened. Hello, Daniel. Amelia's heart skipped. Daniel. Victor had mentioned his nephew once in passing, but there had been no warmth in his words, only regret. Daniel's eyes flicked to Amelia. And who's this? Amelia Brooks, she said, standing up. I work with Victor. Daniel scoffed. Of course you do. Another one of his protégés. Daniel, please, Anna said, her voice pleading. Sit down. Let's talk. Daniel crossed his arms, his body a tense coil of resentment. Talk? After 20 years of silence? After he walked out and left us to pick up the pieces? Victor exhaled slowly, his hands trembling slightly. I didn't mean to abandon you, Daniel. I thought. You thought what? Daniel snapped. That we'd be better off without you? That you could just disappear and we'd be fine? Amelia's chest tightened. The pain in Daniel's voice was raw, like a wound that had never healed. I was falling apart, Victor said, his voice breaking. I didn't know how to stay. Daniel shook his head, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. That's not an excuse. You left Mom, you left Aunt Anna, and you left me. We needed you. The room fell silent, the weight of the past pressing down on all of them. Amelia looked at Victor, his eyes filled with regret so deep it seemed to hollow him out. She thought of all the times he had pushed her, demanded action over hesitation. Now, faced with the consequences of his own inaction, he seemed lost. Finally, Victor spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I know I can't change what I did, but I want to try to make things right. If you'll let me. Daniel's jaw clenched. He turned away, his shoulders heaving. For a moment, Amelia thought he would leave. But then he spoke, his voice hoarse. You can't fix 20 years overnight. I know, Victor said. But I'm here now. And I want to be here. Daniel didn't turn around, but his posture softened, just a fraction. We'll see, he muttered, then walked out the door. The silence left in his wake was heavy. Victor sank back into his chair, his hands covering his face. Anna walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. It's a start, she said gently. Victor nodded, his eyes red. Thank you, Anna, for not shutting me out. You're my brother, she whispered. I can't pretend the past didn't happen, but I can try to move forward. Later that afternoon, Victor and Amelia stood by the old oak tree in the front yard. The breeze rustled the leaves, and the air smelled of damp earth and hope. You did the hardest thing, Amelia said quietly. You showed up. Victor gave a small, sad smile. Showing up is only the beginning. Now comes the hard work. She nodded, thinking of her own life. She had spent so long following Victor's lead, making decisions without questioning if they were her decisions. This trip had unraveled more than just Victor's secrets. It had shown her the fragility of time, the importance of facing what truly mattered. Amelia, Victor said, his voice gentle. I've pushed you hard because I saw your potential, but remember, you get to choose your own path. Don't let anyone else decide it for you. Not even me. His words settled in her heart like seeds. Thank you, she said. I think it's time I figured out what I really want. Victor nodded, his gaze filled with something close to pride. You'll do great things. I know it. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the town, Amelia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Victor's journey wasn't over, and neither was hers. But for the first time, she felt like she was stepping onto a path that was truly her own. She climbed into the car beside Victor, the engine purring to life. As they drove away, the white clapboard house grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the weight in their hearts felt lighter. Sometimes, redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about showing up, facing the truth, and taking the first step toward healing. And as the road stretched out before them, Amelia knew they were both ready to begin again.